Good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to Right and Wrong Exposures Pod broadcast. This is or can be considered the unofficial full length broadcast, so consider it as such. Today's topic will be about history, history of slavery in the world. Again, that's history of slavery in the world. I decided to begin here with this topic um, for our first and official broadcast because I think we need to take a look back in the past to better understand why things have been happening the way they have been in our present day. So I'll pop up or um, bring forth a number of pictures that are not of ours, right and wrong exposure. We're just going to go to Wikipedia, which is everyone can go there, or some of our searches would be in Google, which is based off of, for the most part, the most popular answer. You can also truncate your searches to narrow things down there as well. And Google, for the most part, has um, what's called Google. What is it called here? What's the terminology? It's for uh, Google Academia or something like that. Um, so, anyhow, our topic is about history of slavery in the world. Um, but before we go there, as you can see here, this is where to find us. Find our podcast. Feel free to visit there. That's right and wrong exposure dot podbean dot com. All right. So moving forward, I decided to click on the proclamation. So this is what happened when you click on the picture, and of course I mentioned that we'll bring up pictures, tell you a little about that as I read along. So as I clicked on the proclamation picture after doing a search in Google under the heading History of Slavery in the World, this is what I brought up in Wikipedia. It's quite long, so that's why I say this will be with the reading and going back and forth to the pictures. It would last about an hour and a half to 2 hours long. So let's clock it at just about 6 p.m. and we should be done about 7:30, 8 p.m. Central Standard Time here. Current time is 1803 military time, or 6:03 p.m. Starting with the history of slavery. Uh, the history of slavery spans many cultures, nationalities, and religions, from ancient times to the present day. However, the social, economic, and legal positions of slaves have differed vastly in different systems of slavery in different times and places. Slavery occurs relatively rarely among hunter-gatherer populations because it develops under conditions of social stratification. Slavery operated in the very first civilizations, such as Sumer and Mesopotamia, which dates back as far as 3500 BC. Slavery features in the Mesopotamian code of uh, Hammurabi, that is 1860 BC, which refers to it as an established institution. Slavery became common within much of Europe during the Dark Ages, and it continued into the Middle Ages. The Byzantine Ottoman Wars, that's 1265 to 1479, and the Ottoman Wars in Europe, 14th to 20th century, resulted in the capture of large numbers of Christian slaves. The Dutch, French, Spanish, Portuguese, British, Arabs, and a number of West African kingdoms played a prominent role in the Atlantic slave trade, especially after 1600. David P. Forsyth wrote, "The fact remained that at the beginning of the 19th century, an estimated three-quarters of all people alive were trapped in bondage against their will in some form of slavery or serfdom. The Republic of Ragusa became the first European country to ban the slave trade in 1416. In modern times, Denmark, Norway abolished the trade in 1802. Although slavery is no longer legal anywhere in the world, with the exception of penal labor, human trafficking remains an international problem, and an estimated 25 to 40 million people were enslaved as of 2013. That's an estimated 25 to 40 million people. The majority in Asia. During the 1983 to 2005 Second Sudanese Civil War, people were taken into slavery. Evidence emerged in the late 1990s of systematic child slavery and trafficking on Kikoa, is it Kakoa plantations in West Africa. I'm assuming that's where it's a cocoa plantation. Slavery continues in the 21st century, although Mauritania criminalized slavery in August 2007. An estimated up to 600,000 men, women, and children, or 20% of the population of Mauritania, are currently enslaved, many of them used as bondage labor. Slavery in 21st century Islamic is Islamism continues, and Islamist quasi-states such as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant and Boko Haram have abducted and enslaved women and children, often to serve as sex slaves. That's the 21st century. The origins. Evidence of slavery predates written records and has existed in many cultures. However, slavery is rare among hunter gatherer populations. Mass slavery requires economic surpluses and a high population density to be viable. Due to these factors, the practice of slavery would have only proliferated after the invention of agriculture during the Neolithic Revolution about 11,000 years ago. Slavery was known in civilizations as old as summer. And of course, it's spelled Sumer, could be Sumer, possibly the same meaning, as well as in almost every other ancient civilizations, including ancient Egypt, ancient China, the Akkadian Empire, Assyria, Babylonia, ancient Iran, ancient Greece, ancient India, the Roman Empire, the Arab Islamic uh, Caliphate, was it Caliphate, and Sultanate, Nubia, and the Columbian civilizations of the Americas. Such institutions were a mix of debt slavery, punishment for crime, the enslavement of prisoners of war, which I think the African American or blacks in America are or were, child abandonment, and the birth of slave children to slaves. Okay, this is starting with countries, if you can't see it, starting with Africa. French historian Fernand Braudel noted that slavery was endemic in Africa and part of the structure of everyday life. Slavery came in different guises in different societies. There were court slaves, slaves incorporated into princely armies, domestic and household slaves, slaves working on the land, in industry, as couriers and intermediaries, even as traders. During the 16th century, Europe began to outpace the Arab world in the export traffic, with its slave traffic from Africa to the Americas. The Dutch imported slaves from Asia into their colony in South Africa. In 1807, Britain, which held intensive, although mainly coastal, colonial territories on the African continent, including southern Africa, made the international slave trade illegal, as did the United States in 1808. In Senegambia, which, between 1300 and 1900, close to one third of the population was enslaved. In early Islamic states of the Western Sudan, including Ghana, from 750 to 1076, Mali from 1235 to 1645, Sagu, that's from 1712 to 1861, and Shanghai from 1275 to 1591. About a third of the population was enslaved. In Sierra Leone, in the 19th century, about half of the population consisted of slaves. That's about half. In the 19th century, at least half the population was enslaved among the Douala of the Cameroon, the Igbo, and other peoples of the lower Niger, the Congo, and the Kasanji kingdom, and Chakwi of Angola. Among the Ashanti and Yoruba, a third of the population consisted of slaves. The population of the Kanem was about a third slave. It was perhaps 40% in Bornu. That's from 1396 to 1893. Between 1750 and 1900, half slave half slave in the 19th century, and I actually skipped a sentence. So between 1750 and 1900, from 1 to 2/3 of the entire population of the Fulani Jihad states consisted of slaves. The population of the Sokoto Caliphate, formed by Hassas in northern Nigeria and Cameroon, was half slave in the 19th century. That's not that long ago. It is estimated that up to 90% of the population of Arab, Swahili, Zanzibar, was enslaved. That's 90% of their population. That's incredible. Roughly half the population of Madagascar was enslaved. The Anti Slavery Society estimated that there were 2 million slaves in the early 1930s. Ethiopia, out of an estimated population of between 8 and 6 million. Slavery continued in Ethiopia until the brief Second Itola, uh, that's Italo, Abyssinian War, in October 1935, when it was abolished by order of the Italian occupying forces. In response to pressure by Western allies of World War II, Ethiopia officially abolished slavery and serfdom after regaining its independence in 1942. On 26th of August 1942, Haile Selassie issued a proclamation outlawing slavery. When British rule was first imposed on the Sokoto uh, Caliphate and the surrounding areas in northern Nigeria at the turn of the 20th century, approximately 2 million to 2.5 million people there were slaves. Excuse me. Slavery in northern Nigeria was finally outlawed in 1936, which isn't long ago, less than 100 years ago. Ilikia Mambokola Kolo, April 1998, Lamandi Diplomatic, quote, the African continent was bled of its human resources via all possible routes across the Sahara, through the Red Sea, from the Indian Ocean ports, and across the Atlantic. At least 10 centuries of slavery, 10 centuries of slavery for the benefit of the Muslim countries. From the ninth to the 19th, he continues, 4 million slaves exported via the Red Sea. 4 million. Another 4 million through the Swahili ports of the Indian Ocean. Perhaps as many as 9 million along the trans-Saharan caravan route, and 11 to 20 million, depending on the author, across the Atlantic Ocean. Next is the sub-Saharan Africa. Zanzibar was once East Africa's main slave trading port, and under Omani Arabs in the 19th century, as many as 50,000 slaves were passing through the city each year. Prior to the 16th century, the bulk of slaves exported from Africa were shipped from East Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. Zanzibar became a leading port in this trade. Arab slave traders differed from European ones in that they would often conduct raiding expeditions themselves, sometimes penetrating deep into the continent. They also differed in that their market greatly preferred the purchase of female slaves over male slaves. That's the Arabs. The increased presence of European rivals along the east coast by or led Arab traders to concentrate on the overland slave caravan routes across the Sahara from the Sahel to North Africa. The German explorer Gustav Nachtigal reported seeing slave caravans departing from Kukawa in Bornu, bound for Tripoli and Egypt in 1870. A little over 200 years ago there. The slave trade represented the major source of revenue for the state of Bornu as late as 1898. The eastern regions of the Central African Republic have never recovered demographically from the impact of 19th century raids from the Sudan and still have a population density of less than one person per kilometer. Wow. During the 1870s, Europeans' initiatives against the slave trade caused an economic crisis in northern Sudan, precipitating the rise of Mahdist forces. Mahdi's victory created an Islamic state, one that quickly reinstituted that reinstituted slavery. The Middle Passage, the crossing of the Atlantic to the Americas, endured by slaves laid out in rows in the holds of ships, was only an element of the well-known triangular trade engaged in by Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British. Ships having landed slaves in Caribbean ports would take on sugar, indigo, raw cotton, and later coffee, and make for Liverpool, Nantes, Lisbon, or Amsterdam. Ships leaving European ports for West Africa would carry printed cotton textiles, some originally from India, copper, uh, copper utensils and bangles, pewter plates and pots, iron bars more valued than gold, hats, trinkets, gunpowder and firearms, and alcohol. Tropical shipworms were eliminated in the cold Atlantic waters, and at each unloading, a profit was made. The Atlantic slave trade peaked in the late 18th century when the largest number of slaves were captured on raiding expeditions into the interior of West Africa. These expeditions were typically carried out by African states such as the Oyo Empire, Yoruba, Kong Empire, Kingdom of Benin, Amamate of Futa Jalan, Emamate of Futa Turo, Kingdom of Koya, Kingdom of Kaso, Kingdom of Kabu, Fante Confederacy, Ashanti Confederacy, Aro Confederacy, and the Kingdom of Dahomey. Europeans rarely entered the interior of Africa due to fear of disease and, moreover, fierce African resistance. The slaves were brought to coastal outposts where they were traded for goods. The people captured on these expeditions were shipped by European traders to the colonials of the New World. As a result of the traders, of whom some 15% died during the terrible voyage, many during the arduous journey through the Middle Passage. The great majority were shipped to the Americas, but some also went to Europe and Southern Africa. While talking about the slave trade in East Africa and its journeys, to overdraw its evil is a simple impossibility. To overdraw its evil is a simple impossibility. David Livingstone was traveling in the Great Lakes region in 1866, described a trail of slaves as such. 19th of June, 1866. We passed a woman tied by the neck to a tree and dead. The people of the country explained that she had been unable to keep up with the other slaves in a gang, and her master had determined that she should not become anyone's property if she recovered. 26th of June, we passed a slave woman shot or stabbed through the body and lying on the path. A group of I believe it said meant to say man, but a group of men stood about 100 yards off on one side, and another of the women on the other side, looking on. They said an Arab who passed early that morning had done it in anger at losing the price he had given for her because she was unable to walk any longer. The 27th of June, 1866. Today, we came upon a man dead from starvation, as he was very thin. One of our men wandered and found many slaves with slave sticks on. abandoned by their masters from want of food. They were too weak to be able to speak or say that where they had come from. Some were quite young. The strangest disease I have seen in this country seems really to be brokenheartedness, and it attacks free men who have been captured and made slaves. 21 were unchained, as now safe. However, all ran away at once, but 8, with many others still in chains, died in 3 days after the crossing. They described their only pain in the heart and placed a hand correctly on the spot, though many think the organ stands high up in the breastbone. So, and essentially, they were stating that these those men died from brokenheartedness. I want to remember where I left off here, and we'll take a look at some of the pictures momentarily. However, the next topic or heading of this same discussion is African participation, African participation in the slave trade. So what I'll do is pause this momentarily. I need to grab my cup of coffee. Be right back. Give me about I don't know, 3 minutes. Thanks. Okay, got my coffee. I'm ready. African participation in the slave trade. African states played a role in the slave trade, and slavery was a common practice among sub-Saharan Africans before the involvement of the Arabs, Berbers, and Europeans. There were three types: those who were slaves through conquest, those who were slaves due to unpaid debts, or those whose parents gave them as slaves to tribal chiefs. Chieftains would barter their slaves to Arab, Berber, Ottoman, or European buyers from rum for rum, spices, clothes, or other goods. Selling captives or prisoners was common practice among Africans, Turks, Berbers, and Arabs during that era. However, as the Atlantic slave trade increased its demand, local systems, which excuse me, local systems which primarily serviced indentured servitude expanded. European slave trading, as a result, was the most pivotal change in the social, economic, cultural, spiritual, religious, political dynamics of the concept of slave trading. It ultimately undermined local economies and political stability as villages, vital labor forces were shipped overseas as slave raids and civil wars became commonplace. Crimes which were previously punishable by some other means became punishable by enslavement. Before the arrival of the Portuguese, slavery preexisted in Kingdom of Congo, despite its establishment within its kingdom. Afonso the First of Congo believed that the slave trade should be subject to Congo law. When he suspected the Portuguese of receiving illegal enslaved persons to sell, he wrote letters to the kingdom. Joao III of Portugal in 1526 imploring him to put a stop to the practice. The kings of Dahomey sold their slaves, their war captives, into transatlantic slavery, who otherwise may have been killed in a ceremony known as the annual customs, as one of West Africa's principal slave states. Dahomey became extremely unpopular with neighboring peoples, like the Bambara Empire to the east, the Kaso kingdoms depending heavily on the slave trade for their economy. A family statue or status was indicated by the number of slaves it owned, leading to wars for the sole purpose of taking more captives. This trade led to Kaso and to increasing contact with the European settlements of Africa's west coast, particularly the French. Benin grew increasingly rich during the 16th and 17th century on the slave trade with Europe. Slaves from enemy states of the interior were sold and carried to the Americas in Dutch and Portuguese ships. The Bight of Benin's shore soon came to be known as the Slave Coast. In the 1840s, King Gezo of Dahomey said, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." In 1807, under internal and external pressures, the United Kingdom made illegal the international trade in slaves. The Royal Navy was deployed to prevent slavers from the United States, France, Spain, Portugal, Holland, West Africa, and Arabia. The King of Bani, now in Nigeria, allegedly became dissatisfied of the British intervention in stopping slave trading. "We think this trade must go on. This is the verdict of our oracle and priests. They say that your country, however great, can never stop a trade ordained by God Himself." Wow, amazing. Joseph Miller states that African buyers would prefer males, but in reality, women and children would be more easily captured as men fled. Those captured would be sold for various reasons such as food, debts, or servitude. Once captured, the journey to the coast killed many and weakened others. Disease engulfed many, and insufficient food damaged those who made it to the coast. Scurvy was so common that it was known as Mal de Luanda. Luanda sickness. The assumption for those who died on the journey died from malnutrition. As food was limited, water may have been just as bad. Dysentery was widespread, and poor sanitary conditions at ports did not help. Since supplies were poor, slaves were not equipped with the best clothing that further exposed to more diseases. If the fear of disease caused terror, the psyche of slaves for being captured was just as terrifying. The most popular assumption for being captured was Europeans were cannibals. Stories and rumors spread around that white captured Africans to eat them. That next word is Alaudah, Alada, Equiano accounts his experience about the sorrow slaves encountered at the ports. He talks about his first moment on a slave ship and asked if he was going to be eaten. Yet, the worst for slaves has only begun, and the journey on the water provided to be more terrifying. For every 100 Africans captured, only 64 would reach the coast, and only about 50 would reach the New World. Others believed that slaves had a vested interest in capturing rather than killing, and in keeping their captives alive, and that this, coupled with the disproportionate removal of males and the introduction of new crops from the Americas, cassava and maize, would have limited general population decline to particular regions of Western African or Africa world around of Western Africa around 1760 to 1810, and in Mozambique and neighboring areas half a century later. There's also been speculation that within Africa, females were most often captured as brides, with their male predators being a bycatch who would have been killed if there had not been an export market for them. British explorer Mungo Park encountered a group of slaves when traveling through Mandika country. He states, they were all very inquisitive, but they viewed me at first with looks of horror and repeatedly asked if my countrymen were cannibals. They were very desirous to know what became of the slaves after they had crossed the salt water. I told them that they were employed cultivation, uh, in cultivation, the land, but they would not believe me. A deeply rooted idea that the whites purchased Negroes for the purpose of devouring them, or of selling them to others that they may be devoured, however, are hereafter, naturally makes the slaves contemplate a journey towards the coast with great terror, insomuch that the slaties are forced to keep them constantly in irons and watch them very closely to prevent their escape. During the period from the late 19th century and early 20th century, demand for the labor intensive harvesting of rubber drove frontier expansion and forced labor. The personal monarchy of Belgian King Leopold II in the Congo Free State saw mass killings and slavery to extract rubber. We'll now come back to the Africans on ships, but first let's go back up and look at some of these pictures and come back to the Africans on ships. Okay, I believe from what we've read thus far, these are all of the ports that a lot of the slaves were sold, were taken to, and sold to be extracted to the New Worlds. From this picture, I see, if I can increase it. No, okay. All right, there we go. I see slaves and makeshift wood handcuffs with their slave owners riding on horseback. Makeshift bondage made of wood, rope, and it looks like he's getting ready to kill that slave there. Can't really tell who this is, but I'm assuming that this is a yes, this is a king of Dahomey, an African king, tribesman. This is the inspection and sale of a Negro. This right here, I can't recall, but this is when slavery was abolished. I believe possibly by for the abolishment of the slave trade. That's in 1807. I did read over that. I am assuming that this was done in 2007. Abolishment in 1807, so it was not. I don't know what that 2007 represents. Um, Probably a new coin in 2007. And we're back down to where we just finished reading, but this is a number of the slaves on the slave ships. Okay, and let's see how much time has lapsed. Looks like 48 minutes. All right, keep her going. Africans on ships. Stephanie Smallwood, in her book Saltwater Slavery, uses Equiano's account on board ships to describe the general thoughts of most slaves. And it reads, "Then said I, how comes it in all our country we never heard of them? They told me because they lived so far, so very far off. I then asked, where were their women? Had they all like themselves? And had they any like themselves? I was told that they had. And why? Said I. Do we not see them? They answered, because they were left behind. I asked how the vessel could go. They told me they could not tell, but that there was cloth put upon the masses on the masts by the help of the ropes I saw, and then the vessel went on. And the white men had some spell or magic they put in the water when they liked in order to stop the vessel. I was exceedingly amazed at this account and really thought they were spirits. I therefore wished much to be from amongst them, for I expected they would sacrifice me, but my wishes were vain, for we were so squattered that it was impossible for any of us to make our escape. Accounts like these raised many questions as some slaves grew philosophical with their journey. Smallwood points Smallwood points the challenges for slaves were physical and metaphysical. The physical would be obvious as the challenge to overcome capacity, lack of ship room, and food. The metaphysical was unique as the open sea would challenge African slaves' vision of the ocean as habitable. At essence, the journey on the ocean would prove to be an African's biggest fear that would keep them in awe. Combining this with the lack of knowledge of the sea, Africans would be entering a world of anxiety never seen before. Yet Europeans were also fearful of the sea, but not to the extent of Africans. One of these dilemmas came with a sense of time. Africans used seasonal weather to predict time and days. The moon was a sense of time, but used like in other cultures. On the sea, Africans used the moon to best count the days, but the sea did not provide seasonal changes for them to know how long they were at sea. Counting the days on a ship was not the main priority, however, surviving the voyage was the main horror. No one escaped diseases as the close quarters infected everyone, including the crew. Death was so common that ships were called tambiros of floating tombs or floating tombs. What shocked Africans the most was how death was handled in the ships. Smallwood says the traditions for an African death was delicate and community based. On ships, bodies would be thrown into the sea because the sea represented bad omens. Bodies in the sea represented a form of purgatory, and a ship a form of hell. In the end, the Africans was made who made the journey would have survived diseases, malnutrition, confined spaces, close death, and the trauma of the ship. North Africa. In Algiers, during the time of the Regency of Algiers in North Africa in the 19th century, 1.5 million Christians and Europeans were captured and forced into slavery. This eventually led to the bombardment of Algiers in 1816 by the British and Dutch, forcing the Dey of Algiers to free many slaves. Now we get to what's called modern times. The trading of children has been reported in modern Nigeria and Benin. In parts of Ghana, a family may be punished for an offense by having to turn over a virgin female to serve as a sex slave within the offended family. In this instance, the woman does not gain the title or status of wife. In parts of Ghana, Togo, and Benin, shrine slavery persists. Despite being illegal in Ghana since 1998, in this system of ritual servitude, sometimes called trokasi in Ghana or vodusi in Togo and Benin, young virgin girls are given as slaves to traditional shrines and are used sexually by the priests in addition to providing free labor for the shrine. An article in the Middle East Quarterly in 1999 reported that slavery is endemic in Sudan. Estimates of abductions during the Second Sudanese Civil War range from 14,000 to 200,000 people. During the Second Sudanese Civil War, people were taken into slavery. Estimates of abductions range from 14,000 to 200,000. Abduction of Dinka women and children were common. In Mauritania, it is estimated that up to 600,000 men, women, and children, or 20% of the population, are currently enslaved, many of them used as bondage labor. Slavery in Mauritania was criminalized in August 2007. During the Darfur conflict that began in 2003, many people were kidnapped by Janjaweed and sold into slavery as agricultural labor, domestic servants, and sex slaves. In Niger, slavery is also a current phenomenon. A Nigerian study has found that more than 800,000 people are enslaved, almost 8% of the population. Niger installed an anti slavery provision in 2003. In a landmark ruling in 2008, the ECOWAS Community Court of Justice declared that the Republic of Niger failed to protect Jatu, Hadijatu, excuse me for tearing that name up, Mani Kareu from slavery, and awarded Mani, that's the CFA, $10 million, approximately 20,000 in U.S. currency, in reparations. Uh, Sexual slavery and forced labor are common in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Again, that's sexual slavery and forced labor are common in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Many pygmies in the Republic of Congo and Democratic Republic of Congo belong from birth to Bantus in a system of slavery. Evidence emerged in the late 1990s of systematic slavery in cocoa plantations in West Africa. See the Chocolate and Slavery article. According to the U.S. State Department, more than 109,000 children were working on cocoa farms alone in Ivory Coast in the worst forms of child labor. That was in 2002. On the night of on the night of 14 to 15 of April 2014, a group of militants attacked the government girls' secondary school in Chibok, Nigeria. That's in 2014. They broke into the school pretending to be guards, telling the girls to get out and come with them. A large number of students were taken away in trucks, possibly into the Kandugo, Kanduga area of the Sambisa forest, where Boko Haram were known to have fortified camps. Houses in Chibok were also burned down in the incident. According to police, approximately 276 children were taken in the attack, of whom 53 had escaped as of May. Other reports said that 329 girls were kidnapped, 53 had escaped, and 276 were still missing. The students have been forced to convert to Islam and into marriage for members of Boko Haram, with a reputed bride price. That's $2,000 each. It looks like between $12.50 to as little as $7.50. Many of the students were taken into the neighboring countries of Chad and Cameroon, with sightings reported of the students crossing borders with the militants, and sightings of the students by villagers living in the Sambisa forest, which is considered a refugee for Boko Haram. On May 5th, 2014, a video in which Boko Haram leader Abu Bakr Shekau claimed responsibility for the kidnapping emerged. Shekau or Sheku claimed that Allah instructed me to sell them. I will carry out his instructions, and slavery is allowed in my religion, and I should capture people and make them slaves. He said the girls should not have been in school and instead should have been married since girls as young as 9 are suitable for marriage. Libyan slave trade. During the Second Libyan Civil War, Libyans started capturing some of the sub-Saharan African migrants trying to trying to get to Europe through Libya and selling them on slave markets. Slaves are often ransomed to their families, and in the meantime, until ransom can be paid, they may be tortured, forced to work, sometimes worked to death, and eventually they may be executed or left to starve if the payment has not been made after a period of time. Women are often raped and used as sex slaves and sold to brothels. Many child migrants also suffer from abuse and child rape in Libya. The Americas. In pre-colonial Mesoamerican, the most common forms of slavery were those of prisoners of war and debtors. That's what I believe that our ancestors were prisoners of war, not slaves, just prisoners of war. To continue, it says people unable to pay back debts could be sentenced to work as slaves to the persons owned until the debts were worked off. Warfare was important to Maya society because raids on surrounding areas provided the victims required for human sacrifice, as well as slaves for the construction of temples. Most victims of human sacrifice were prisoners of war or slaves. According to Aztec writings, as many as 84,000 people were sacrificed at a temple inauguration in 1487. Slavery was not usually hereditary. Children of slaves were born free. In the Inca Empire, workers were subject to a mida in lieu of taxes, which they paid by working for the government. Each elu, or extended family, would decide which family member to send to do that. Would decide which family member to send to do the work. It is unclear if the labor, draft, or corvée counts as slavery. The Spanish adopted this system, particularly for their silver mines in Bolivia. Other slave owning societies and tribes of the New World were, for example, the Tehuti of Patagonia, the Comanche of Texas, the Caribs of Dominica, the Tupinamba of Brazil, the fishing societies such as the Yurok that lived along the coast from what is now Alaska to California, the Pawnee and Klamath, many of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast, such as the Haida and Lakjit, were traditionally known as fierce warriors and slave traders, raiding as far as California. Slavery was hereditary, the slaves being prisoners of war. Among some Pacific Northwest tribes, about a quarter of the population was slaves. One slave narrative was composed by a Englishman, John R.W., who had been taken alive when his ship was captured in 1802. His memoir provides a detailed look at his life as a slave and asserts that a large number were held. Spanish America, during the period from the late 19th century and early 20th century demand for the labor-intensive harvesting of rubber drove frontier expansion and slavery in Latin America and elsewhere. Indigenous people were enslaved as part of the rubber boom in Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. In Central America, rubber tapers participated in the enslavement of the indigenous, that is, Watuso, Maleku people for domestic service. In Brazil, slavery was a mainstay of the Brazilian colonial economy, especially in mining and sugarcane production. 35.3% of all slaves involved in the Atlantic slave trade, went to Brazil. That's 35.3%. 4 million slaves were obtained by Brazil, 1.5 million more than any other country. Starting around 1550, the Portuguese began to trade African slaves to work the sugar plantations. Once the native Tupi people deteriorated, although Portuguese Prime Minister Sebastio Jose de Carvalho e Melo, first Marquis of Pombal, abolished slavery in main port Portugal on February 12th, 1761. Slavery continued in her overseas colonies. Slavery was practiced among all classes. Slaves were owned by upper and middle classes, by the poor, and even by other slaves. So, what that tells me is that it became, over the years, hundreds of years, ingrained in these people since the start of near the beginning of time. um, yeah. Continuing the from Sao Paulo, the Bandeirantes adventurers, mostly of mixed Portuguese and native ancestry, penetrated steadily westward in their search for Indian slaves along the Amazon River and its major tributaries. Repeated slaving raids and punitive attacks left their mark on French. One French traveler in the 1740s described hundreds of miles of river banks with no sign of human life and once thriving villages that were devastated and empty. In some areas of the Amazon basin, and particularly among the Guarani of southern Brazil and Paraguay, the Jesuits had organized their Jesuit reductions along military lines to fight the slavers. In the mid to late 19th century, many Am- Amerindians, Amerindians were enslaved to work on rubber plantations. So by 1740s, if you were to go back on what I just read, uh, noting one of the amongst the Guaranis of southern Brazil, actually no, that what I'm looking for is where he stated that in 1740s described hundreds of miles of river banks with no sign of human life. That's amazing. That means that by 1740s, not even the 1800s or 19th century, uh, the place had just been cleaned out. Okay, so you have a resistance and abolition, and you have the British and French Caribbean. So what we'll do is stop reading there at the Anglo North America. Actually, we'll take it down to the early events just beyond the Anglo North America. And looking at the time, looks like an hour and 12 minutes. So we'll finish up there. Resistance and abolition. Escaped slaves formed maroon communities, which played an important role in the histories of Brazil and other countries such as Suriname, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Jamaica. In Brazil, the maroon villages were called palin- palinquis or palincas or quilombos. Maroons survived by growing vegetables and hunting. They also raided plantations. At these attacks, the Maroons would burn crops, steal livestock and tools, kill slave masters, and invite other slaves to join their communities. Jean Baptiste Debret, a French painter who was active in Brazil in the first decades of the 19th century, started out with painting portraits of members of the Brazilian imperial family, but soon became concerned with the slavery of both blacks and indigenous inhabitants. His paintings on the subject to appear on this page helped bring attention to the subject in both Europe and Brazil itself. The Clayfam sect, a group of evangelical reformers, campaigned during much of the 19th century for Britain to use its influence and power to stop the traffic of slaves to Brazil. Besides moral qualms, the low cost of slave produced Brazilian sugar meant that British colonies in the West Indies were unable to match the market price of Brazilian sugar, and each Briton was consuming 16 pounds of sugar a year by the 19th century. That's 7 16 pounds or 7 kg. This combination led to intensive pressure from the British government for Brazil to end this practice, which it did by steps over several decades. First, foreign slave trade was banned in 1850. Then, in 1871, the sons of the slaves were freed. In 1885, slaves aged over 60 years were freed. The Paraguayan War contributed to ending slavery, since many slaves enlisted in exchange for freedom. In colonial Brazil, slavery was more a social than a racial condition. Some of the greatest figures of the time, like the writer Machado de Assis and the engineer R.A.W. had black ancestry. Brazil's 1877 to 78 Grande Seca, Great Drought, in the cotton growing Northeast led to major turmoil, starvation, poverty, and internal migration. As wealthy plantation holders rushed to sell their slaves south, popular resistance and resentment that's resistance and resentment grew, inspiring numerous emancipation societies. They succeeded in banning slavery altogether in the province of Ceará by 1840 or 1884. Slavery was legally ended nationwide on May 13th. That's by the Lua, the Golden Law of 1888. It was an institution in decadence at these times, as since the 1800s the country had begun to use European immigrant labor instead. Brazil was the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. So it sounds like Brazil took in 35.3% of all slaves involved in the Atlantic slave trade. However, they were the last to abolish it. And I'm catching where I was here. See here. Okay. Okay, just about done. British and French Caribbean. Slavery was commonly used in the parts of the Caribbean controlled by France and the British Empire. The Lesser Antilles islands of Barbados, St. Kitts, Antigua, Martinique, Guadeloupe, which were the first important slave societies of the Caribbean, began the widespread use of African slaves by the end of the 17th century as their economies converted from sugar production. That's converted from sugar production. England had multiple sugar islands in the Caribbean, especially Jamaica, Barbados, Nevis, and Antigua, which provided a steady flow of sugar sales. Slave labor produced the sugar. By the 1700s, there were more slaves in Barbados than all the colonies combined. Since the Barbados did not have many mountains, the British were able to clear land from sugar cane. Indentured servants were initially sent to Barbados to work in the sugar fields. These indentured servants were treated so poorly that future indentured servants stopped going to Barbados, and there were not enough people to work the fields. This is when the British started bringing in African slaves. It was important for the slaves to be in Barbados because sugar had become a necessity for most people, and the demand for it was high. As important an important result of British victory in the War of the Spanish successions, Succession at 1702 to 1714 was enlarging its role in the slave trade. Of special importance was the successful secret negotiation with France to obtain 30-year monopoly on the Spanish slave trade, called the As- Asiento. That's the Asiento, called the Asiento. Queen Anne, that's Queen Anne of Great Britain, also allowed her North American colonies like Virginia to make laws that promoted black slavery, and had secretly negotiated with with France to get its approval regarding the Asientos. She boasted to Parliament of her success in taking the Asiento away from France, and London celebrated her economic coup. Most of the slave trade involved sales to Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and to Mexico, as well as sales to British colonies in the Caribbean and in North America. Historian Renita Ricks says the agreement allotted Queen Anne 22.5% and King Philip the Fifth of Spain 28% of all profits collected for her personal fortune. Ricks concludes that the Queen's connection to slave trade revenue meant that she was no longer a neutral observer. She had a vested interest in what happened on slave ships. By 1778, the French was importing approximately 13,000 Africans for enslavement yearly to the French West Indies. To legalize slavery, in 1685, Louis the Ninth had enacted the Code Noir, Noir, which accorded which accorded certain human rights to slaves and responsibilities to the master, who was obliged to feed, clothes, and provide for the general well-being of his slaves. Free blacks owned one third. Again, that's free blacks owned one third of the plantation property and one quarter of of the slaves in Saint Dominique, later Haiti. Slavery in the French First Republic was abolished on February 4th, 1794, when it became clear that Napoleon intended to reestablish slavery in Haiti. Dessalines and Pétion switched sides in October 1802. On January 1st, 1804, Jean Jacques Dessalines, the new leader under the dictatorial 1801 constitution, declared Haiti a free republic. Thus, Haiti became the second independent nation in the Western Hemisphere after the United States. and the only successful slave rebellion in world history. Give it up to Haiti, and that was in 1801. So Haiti has been freed for over 200 years. Just about done here. We're wrapping up in about 10 minutes. So, Whitehall in England announced in 1833 that slaves in its territories would be totally freed by 1840. In the meantime, the government told slaves, they had to remain on their plantations and would have the statues of apprentice for the next 6 years. In Port of Spain, Trinidad, on August 1st, 1834, an unarmed group of mainly elderly Negroes being addressed by the government or the governor at Government House about the new laws began chanting Pas de six ans, point de six ans, not 6 years, not six, no 6 years, not 6 years, no 6 years. That's what basically they were saying there, drowning out the voice of the governor. Peaceful protests continued until a resolution to abolish apprenticeship was passed, and de facto freedom was achieved. Full emancipation for all was legally granted ahead of schedule on August 1st, 1938, making Trinidad the first British colony with slaves to completely abolish slavery. That's by 1838. After Great Britain abolished slavery, it began to pressure other nations to do the same. France, too, abolished slavery. By then, Saint Dominique had already won its independence, that's Haiti, and formed the independent Republic of Haiti. French controlled islands were then limited to a few smaller islands in the Lesser Antilles. And last couple paragraphs states early events. In 1619, 20 Africans were brought to the English colony of Jamestown, Virginia. Historians are undecided if the legal practice of slavery began there. Of course not, since at least some of them had the status of indentured servant. Alden T. Vaughan says most agree that both Negro slaves and indentured servants existed by 1640. Only a fraction of the enslaved Africans brought to the New World came to British North America, perhaps as little as 5% of the total. The vast majority of slaves were sent to the Caribbean sugar colonies, Brazil, or Spanish America. By the 1680s, with the consolidation of England's Royal African Company, enslaved Africans were arriving in England or English colonies in larger numbers, and the institution continued to be protected by the British government. Colonists now began purchasing slaves in larger numbers. Okay, so more pictures, and we're going to actually end this broadcast here. This is a slave woman, and of course, the slave women probably reared up some of the children of the slave owners. I am looking at this, and it says a funeral at slave plantation during Dutch colonial rule. And it looks as if they were probably doing more of a celebration than and dance than sadness at a funeral. Looks as if some slaves are being whipped, and to take some of the pressure off of the uh, police slash slave hunters slash slave owners, they gave it to another slave who some of us blacks sometimes call as coons. But of course, the slave that's doing the whipping with the whip probably didn't have much choice. So, and as you can see, they gather around to see the whipping. I guess it was a different type of entertainment there. But anywho, 30, according to the video that I posted, which is not mine, and I basically gave you the source on who did it. Uh, they used to receive 30 lashes, and that's uh, that's a lot. You know, a lot of us can't even take one whip nowadays. And this is I'm assuming a crossing, Guarani family captured by Indian slave hunters. It's like a family of six. This is slaves cutting the sugar canes in British colony of Antigua. That's 1823. And you got to give it up to the slaves, prisoners of war, that um, are very strong people. However, I'm just thinking about the knives. They probably weren't that sharp whatsoever. You even got the babies out there trying to help mom or whatever. But all right. And moving forward, we got what I guess this is their form of dress here. Uh, Coupling up there. It's mostly a younger group of slaves there, strong but young. All right, and this is about it. So I don't know who's coming to visit there. It says well-dressed plantation owner and family visiting the slave quarters. Didn't know it, but it seemed like that's what was going on. All right, and a little bit better picture there. Um, Horse, wagon, James Hopkinson's plantation, South Carolina, 1862. Um, so we'll go ahead and end it there and just mention that uh, I brought the topic up for a reason. So I will continue with, um, say, tomorrow with a update on uh, this topic here, and I certainly would want to begin to outline problems, reactions, and some solutions. But that may take until about Wednesday of this week. For those of you who did listen or will listen in the future, I hope you enjoy my reading. So otherwise, it is currently 7:36. So we went for about an hour and 37 or so minutes. Thanks again, and be sure to hit the share button, the like button. Not too big on the likes. I just want you to get it out there by sharing. Do more so of sharing than liking or stuff like that. So thanks again, and for listening to What's Right and What's Wrong.